Rolling. Welcome back, everybody. So we had a pretty epic turnout on the field trip. We had 3 out of 10 students on that, but we had a pretty good time. It was beautiful, and the lion's share of the rain that we hit was overnight. Really, we were pretty much out by the time I got back on the water on Sunday morning. We saw a whole bunch of bald eagles. Or really, we saw the same couple bald eagles over and over and over, and that particular chunk of it made the trip extra nice for those of us who like seeing bald eagles, which is most of us typically. They are charismatic megafauna after all, and they are also tying into our next chunk of this class, which is going to be after we finish the typical impact patterns to wildlife based on human recreation. The next chunk we're going to get into are wildlife behavioral responses to human incursion and human impacts. There's a list of about 7 of those, and we'll add one fresh one to that as well, providing we can get to it. There's a lot in the impact section, unfortunately. This particular slideshow is 120 slides long. There's lots of examples of how we impact wildlife, direct and on-site, approaching the wildlife, harassment, that sort of a thing, or in rarer cases, throwing rocks at wildlife or fashioning makeshift spears. People have been doing this for the last 100,000 years, right? And in a recreation context, that can be fun and recreational unless you're the wildlife at the business end of that makeshift spear or the snare or the chunk of habitat that's pretty critical for your access to one habitat or another that is being used or degraded by, or fragmented maybe, by human recreationists. So we have a lot going on. It's pretty intense. So we left off last Wednesday talking about caribou jams, elk jams, bear jams, and I have a lot of video examples of these because every time we go on summer camp for the last 15 years, we see these. This is a daily occurrence in places like Grand Teton National Park. And the reason it's very common at Grand Teton and much less of a problem at a place like Shawnee National Forest has everything to do with the topology, the connectedness, the travel corridors of one place versus the other. So, Grand Teton National Park is essentially a tall rectangle on the map north oriented up, where you've got the Teton Range, and Grand Teton, and Little Teton, and then right in front of those you have a whole bunch of really beautiful Wyoming lakes, and then you've got the Snake River headwaters collecting water off of the southern and western greater Yellowstone ecosystem and flowing that south and downstream toward Moose, Wyoming, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Jackson Hole is a gateway community right there on the map. And then we've got this little area up here that is the John D. Rockefeller Memorial Parkway, that is run by the United States National Park Service. That is specifically created by Rockefeller and his children as a charitable donation to the people of the United States so that wildlife species could migrate off of the Yellowstone Plateau, which is high elevation. Snake River Plateau on sort of this flatter eastern side of the Tetons, kind of pancake flat, is pretty good, or at least it's better, more survivable winter or overwintering habitat than being trapped up high on the Yellowstone Plateau and having to post hole through 6-foot, 8-foot snowdrifts. If you're a bison that's less than 8 feet tall, that's really hard work, and that takes a lot of calories. Calories are the fundamental bottom line of survival in a cold environment like this. All summer is about building calories, storing them. All winter is about conserving so that you use as few as possible, stay as close to your basal metabolic rate with different adaptive strategies like hibernation or torpor versus low energy sort of migration and herding versus nomadic snow hunting to try and get as many calories as possible at a higher calorie cost to do so. So, jams are a thing here because this is a highway that goes up through here, Memorial Parkway, the major north-south highway that connects the bottom and top ends of Grand Teton National Park, and then up into the Yellowstone sort of big circle road up there. There are bison all throughout this all year long, and especially in the winter down here. So the bison are going across that road. They're going up and down river terraces. It's very clearly visible for those of you who are hydrogeologists or fluvial or channel morphologists, the shape and conformation of riverine systems. You can see the river terraces, and each of those terraces has more or less vegetation of each specific type, right? Progressively wetter and lower to the river, the Snake River, as we go down slope. And that means different kinds of nutrients available in different vegetative communities on each of those terraces. So the bison are basically low-key going up and down those terraces kind of all day long. And those terraces, since the river runs north-south, the stair-step effect of those river terraces runs east-west. So if they're going to stairmaster their way all throughout the summer to browse vegetation, to raise their young, and so forth, our road, our connectedness, our topology, how we have linked together John D. Rockefeller Memorial Parkway, which itself is linking together to major popular crown jewel national parks, that puts human vehicles and people in direct proximity to bison, as the bison are just slowly meandering across the road. So, with larger migratory ungulates like bison, like elk and stuff like that are herd animals, the caribou we'll see some examples of in Rocky Mountain National Park here in a sec. They're just crossing the road because they have to get to the other side, as the joke goes, to get to the food on the other side, that calorie density. But for the human beings, this is a recreation opportunity, right? One of our primary reasons for going to parks is to see the bald eagles as we're paddling along at Ozark National Scenic Riverways and having a blast doing it. Gorgeous weekend. One of our primary reasons for going to Teton is like driving there all night and all day, close to a 24-hour drive to get out there, and then pile out at one of about 50 different spots where you can pull out to park your vehicle, look at the Tetons as your brain is completely fried from driving like 22 hours straight from Illinois. And you elbow the person next to you and you go, "How pretty is that?" And they say, "That's pretty, pretty. Nice. All right, let's get back in the car. Let's go to the visitor center. I gotta take a dump." All right? And then you get back in the car and it's like 2-3 hours before you can get to the visitor center, and now you got a problem. You're like floating around behind your eyeballs because the bison are moving back and forth, and that's okay. We can get vehicles through and around, moving bison, not a problem. They're not exactly speed demons. The problem is that a lot of visitors are not trying to get around the bison. They're trying to get to the bison. The bison are the resource, right? Viewing the bison is the opportunity, the experience that folks are coming from. And it seems like for some visitors who aren't really thinking about it, gosh, these bison came to me. Let's pull off and take some photos and so forth. And as you're pulling off, that's creating a traffic jam. As you're pulling off, you are dealing with all of the other literally hundreds of visitors who've got that same idea of let's pull off and check this out. And everybody is opening their car door onto a 50-mile-an-hour highway and not really thinking about, there could be a delivery truck or a garbage truck to service the 10,000 people staying here overnight kind of a thing. And we have kids darting in and out of traffic and so forth. So when you have big wildlife near a road, most of our major national parks, probably the one you selected, is going to bring your visitors close to wildlife. It's easier and it's cheaper and it's more sustainable to run our roads through low valleys, low flat areas, plains, meadows, where we don't have to dynamite 20 feet of road into a cliff face and make a very, very expensive road that the wildlife are not going to be affected by. right? The economics don't work in the favor of wildlife surviving, putting hundreds of thousands or millions of vehicles through those road systems, right? Even if most everybody is doing a mostly great job, out of 1 million people, even a couple of hit by vehicles adds up pretty fast. Okay, so we're not gonna listen to the audio on this. This is me from, I don't know, maybe 2007 at Rocky Mountain National Park, and this is a caribou jam or an elk jam. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of elk just browsing right at the side of the road. Okay, so there's like 70 or 80 of them right there. And in the background, just inbound of that snowfield, is this. So this, people walking alongside the road to get closer to those elk or caribou. Both are very prominent or present at Rocky Mountains National Park. Okay? We get this kind of a traffic situation all day, every day. And folks are not coming to national parks for dealing with traffic jams. That's not part of the motivation. That's not part of the opportunity that the Park Service is trying to present. But this forms every single day, to the point that like nobody in Park Service work is surprised when you mention the phrase elk jam. Like, this really is an everyday thing. There's a last time I was at Grand Teton, maybe 6-7 years ago, there was a volunteer army of people with like high-vis reflective, like construction vests, safety vests, that kind of thing. And their entire volunteer job was to manage this. Like, many dozens of people volunteering their whole day, each day during the peak season, in return for maybe a free campsite, something like that. Does that make sense? And there are several entire staff whose job it is to deal with this and make sure this doesn't become a problem for, in Yosemite, it's going to be the bears. In Rocky and Teton, it's going to be elk. In Teton and Yellowstone, it's going to be bison. This is just over and over and over and over a continuous problem. And we talked last week about how sometimes somebody, if they see a calf or the young of one of these separated from the group, then they'll try to herd it into their vehicle. And in a few cases, even seat belt them in to drive them to the ranger station to drop off the bison calf, which is now going to be most likely rejected by the herd because it doesn't smell, or maybe it has not been fed the normal things that bison calves should be fed. They now smell like humans, and that is not a great smell if you're a baby bison trying to not be rejected by your herd. Okay? So, it's understandable, right? Who wouldn't want to see a whole bunch of reindeer? If these are caribou, for example. That's exciting, right? A lot of us have never seen live reindeer, certainly not in the wild. Maybe at like an advent petting zoo if you live here in the flatland, low elevation Midwest and you're near a big church or something. Or you've seen it in like the afternoon specials, Like, live reindeer are pretty cool. They're like fancy deer. And they are right at the edge of the road, okay? So, this is a problem. This is a safety concern for the people because people are getting, we'll see, bluff charged, defensive charge, and aggression charged when they get way too close. Let's see if we have, so same thing at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, well east of the Rockies, right? You see everybody's blinkers go on, and this is one of those releaser cues. Like with graffiti, you see somebody else stand on their brakes, and it's like, oh, well, they must see something exciting, or something very important to avoid just up ahead. I better stand on my brakes too, and let's create this sort of logjam effect as we drive on by. Okay? So everybody slows way, way down. You get a lot of rear-ending accidents as people are rubbernecking and then bam, right into the car in front of them. Now we have two damaged vehicles, some of which, in more rare cases, it's a much higher speed collision. Now we're leaking any of the hundreds of chemicals in an internal combustion engine vehicle into this habitat. Yeah? This is exacerbated once again, just as a reminder, that where we have roads, we need to think about is the Park Service, or maybe like in the case of Ozark Scenic Riverways, Shannon County Road Authority, are they spreading a bunch of salt in the winter and bringing a whole bunch of ungulates that are looking for a salt lick, looking for the minerals in the salt, to the roadside specifically, where tires are going to splash that stuff onto whatever vegetation, evergreen or dormant deciduous, is at the side of the road in the middle of the winter, right? So they're licking dirty slush. Not good for the wildlife, okay? So there are a bazillion examples of these. I'm not going to go through all of them at full speed. But it's to the point now where, and this is from summer camp, it's to the point now where park staff have to radio to each other, and everybody on the park staff radio relay system is on a common channel for tasks like this, where we've got one of our elk herds, crossing the road at such and such visitor center, and then law enforcement staff and volunteer visitor management folks have to kind of deploy in force to deal with that traffic jam, to keep people moving, to keep people safely off the road, when all they want to do is just walk through traffic and see the thing. Like, we drove so far to see this. This is why I'm here. I don't care if I'm blocking traffic. I don't care if I'm putting myself in danger. I don't care if I'm putting the wildlife in harm's way. I want my cell phone video with the wildlife. So, deer jam, elk jam, grizzly jam, there's a bunch of them. Grand Canyon, right? This is not a good idea. You see how close these people are? They're like 3.5 body lengths away from an animal that can put them in the hospital without really even trying, right? 3 different forestry faculty members have been sent to the emergency room, one with a collapsed lung several years ago, in Thompson Woods with whitetail, because mama whitetail don't like it when people are just walking through Thompson Woods and they ruck up on a fawn or a yearling, which is frozen in place and hiding. They'll do a defensive charge, and if they get one of those hooves through, like, or between your ribs, right, that's puncturing your pericardial sac or your pleural sac, the organ-like sort of sac around your lungs. And that's really, really serious stuff. And nobody can blame the wildlife for doing it. Nobody can blame the forestry professors. It's hard to see fawns, right? That's the whole point of them freezing as predators like us walk by. But in this case, yeah, we can find fault. Like, nobody is holding a gun to anybody's head to get into this. So, elk jam at Grand Canyon. All right. Fast forwarding to the action here. This one's a little bit harder to see with a shaky cam, but there are elk all throughout here, just moving through Mather Campground. We've got a bunch more videos like this last summer, although I haven't put them in this PowerPoint yet. And so what we typically don't see when we're looking at YouTube videos of somebody's trip, or TikToks of somebody's trip, is all of the other people behind us doing the same thing. And what happens is, you've got the wildlife, individual organism, you've got person 1, person 2, person 3, all slowly scooting forward. How close can I get? How many blurry pixels on my crappy cell phone camera can I fill with elk or bison or whatever to make this particularly special? This video is, you can't see anything, it's at night, but let's turn the volume up for this one. Let's see. The Grand Canyon, it's, so we can get the Elio's, oh, they're getting pissed.
Everybody's like, it's an elk.
I think I cut this video off before they started flashing lights and sirens. Nope, there we go. So, a big part of your job as a LEO, a law enforcement ranger, law enforcement officer, conservation police for parks, is dealing with stuff like this, protecting the wildlife by getting people back on their asses in their vehicles and moving away. That particular video was of a massive bull elk with a huge rat. I mean, just absolutely stupefying, just monster of an elk. And just a monster elk. And it was really exciting. It was browsing about 2 feet off the side of the road. Like, if I was a hunter, I would be losing my mind at that minute because, man, you could pay thousands of dollars for a highly curated elk hunt here in Utah or Wyoming, Colorado, any of those big western states where elk habitat's a big deal, and not even see an elk of that size and quality, right? Thousands of dollars invested for just a chance to see something like that, and here we are just driving to our campsite and we see it. But the LEOs have to bug everybody, make everybody a little bit unhappy, because if we let everybody be happy with, approaching the wildlife at night and like blinding this thing, right? People are trying to get their cars aimed at it in the middle of traffic so they can essentially spotlight it with their headlights and dazzle the thing so it can look up and kind of blink at them and they can get that photo, maybe, probably not with their cell phone camera. This is a problem. So this is like continuous harassment. This is all day long. So imagine you're trying to feed and this is happening all day long to you. Not good. Okay? Now, the other way that this really takes place is harassment by pet, almost always dog. So this is a huge, huge deal. We want to kind of get a sense of this by multiplying it out numbers-wise. So, pull out a sheet of paper. And this is just a very simple multiplication exercise. You're free to use your cell phone calculator. And this is something you'll want to be doing for your chosen part as well, outside of class here. Okay? So, for each one of these, we want to take a look at the individual impact shown in the short video clip or picture. Just figure out what it is. Qualitatively, so describe it to yourself in one sentence on the first line of your sheet of paper. And then multiply that by an arbitrary large number. Here I've got multiply by 1,000 family pet dogs. We're not talking about feral animals here. We're talking about animals brought in and not on leash. And if Yosemite Valley has about 20,000 people in it, 20,000 visitors at a time, at any given moment during peak summer season, let's say 1 out of 20 families there brought their dog. That's actually a low ball estimate, but it makes for a nice round number. Okay? If there are 20,000 people in Yosemite and 5% of those people, 1 in 20, brought a dog, then that's 1,000 dogs in Yosemite Valley at a given time. Okay? These numbers will be slightly different for your park, but they're going to be kind of same ballpark. And for management purposes, we generally don't need the specific number down to the decimals. We just need kind of the order of magnitude. How many zeros are after that first number? That's called order of magnitude. Just ballpark, how big is it? Are we talking 100,000, 1,000, 100, 10, 1? Those are all orders of magnitude of the same number. Then multiply that number by 180 days. again, for very round numbers, we'll say that our peak season is 6 months even, 6 months long. About 180 days. Really, it's 182.675, something like that. But close enough, 180. Okay, so what we're gonna get is, let's say we have a problem of an acoustically or aurally ear-sensitive, hearing-sensitive wildlife species like bats. And we have a dog that is super freaked out because it can probably smell more than it can see bats in a grotto, which is a cave that is not very deep, a cave where sunlight can hit the back wall of it. We've got bats, we've got a dog. The dog is barking because it's freaked out. Okay? So, the impact of the bats in that case is going to be increased metabolism when they should be in daytime slumber mode. They're burning more calories, not because of anything they're doing, it's because the dog is waking them up and they gotta figure out what's going on, assess the dog, and maybe, hopefully, eventually, get back to sleep. Kind of like how when there's something exciting or distracting happening in the hallway or out the window here in class, it takes you about 20 minutes to return to completely full and meaningful focus whenever we're working on here in class. So your professors close the door, right? It's going to take those bats a little bit of time to drop back down to basal metabolic slumbering rate to conserve the calories they worked so hard just the previous night to eat like their body weight worth in insects. Okay? So we're going to get some big number of bark disturbances versus bats in a grotto, for example. Okay, if that was the content shown in the video. All right, so what is the impact for this? What is the impact to your wildlife if somebody brings their cat? And this is an increasing thing. More people are treating their cats like dogs, buying body harnesses and leashes or leads, and bringing them along on trips. And every once in a while, that dog or that cat gets away and either is found or returns, or it doesn't, and it is loose in the park. Does anybody know how many birds that feral cats kill each year? Billion. It's a lot. Cats are pretty good predators. Birds make delicious prey, and so this could be a problem. All right? We have wildlife in the upper right-hand corner there, modifying their behavior to give the dog a hard time. This is cute and funny for us, but the bird is undertaking a fairly dangerous thing for some specific perceived need. Think about that. Okay? So, let's pick just one impact out of all of those possible here. Let's say 1 in 20 people are bringing their cat to a park. And cats and dogs can bring in diseases to your wildlife if they have at least somewhat similar physiology. And those disease organisms vectored through the pet and the unknowing owner bringing that pet, you can jump to your wildlife. And disease spreads from one species across to another, that's called spillover. And then when that species reinfects the original introducing species, it's called spillback. This is a thing. And with stuff like large-scale habitat degradation and loss that we've done basically all over the world now, we now have to worry about spillover and spillback, right? You may have heard of the pandemic, which could have, if it wasn't in a virology lab in Wuhan, be from bats sold at a nearby wet market in Wuhan. Who knows? We may never know. But the point here is, if 1 in 20 visitors to any particular park, let's say the park has 1 million visitors during peak season, you would enter in 1 million times 0.05. 1/20th. 0.05. And get a number. That's how many cats are being brought in our hypothetical example. Okay. Now, let's say that out of all of the cats, there are 1% that are bringing in an exogenous illness, disease, pathogen, parasite. You hit the multiply button again, and the divide button if you're feeling super proud. Multiply by 0.01 to get some smaller number. And this is how many disease origination events you're dealing with just that year. Just because somebody wanted to bring Fluffy the cat, or Mr. Bigglesworth, or whatever you name your cat. This is how many new disease events you're dealing with, specifically because your visitors brought a pet. Now, pets are a very charismatic, not wildlife, but domesticated species, right? There's something that activates in our brain when your puppy dog looks at you with those puppy dog eyes, right? Like, this is such a thing encoded into our awareness that puppy dog eyes is kind of a trope, you know? Like, that's a recognizable thing. It stands for a lot more. It's a nice, quick shorthand for other things. Okay? That is an adaptive or selective breeding or other competitive strategy on the part of dogs to get free food for life, free veterinary care. Okay? Cats have different musculature along their eye ridges, so cats, by definition, anatomically can't give you puppy dog eyes, but dogs can. And so we as humans interpret or view, sort of preconsciously, dogs as a little bit like human young. Does anybody know of a term that you could refer to a beloved dog that is treated like a child? Anybody know what folks call their pets when they're basically their kids? Have you ever heard of the term fur baby? Yeah, my children are four-legged kind of thing. My other car is a fur baby minivan, that kind of thing. Just little bumper stickers. Alright, so 1 million visitors a year, 1 in 20 visitors brings a cat, 1% of those brought in cats, exogenous cats, bring in some pathogenic disease to your wildlife. Bobcat, maybe, or mountain lion, or something that can spread across to other mammal species like deer. Lots of different diseases these days to pick from. What number do you get? 1 million divided by 20, and then divided by 100. What number do you get? 500? Okay. That's a lot of disease transmission events to deal with, you know? Like if in this class, for example, we had 500 disease transmission events, we'd all be dead by the end of the semester. Does that make sense? Okay, so this just puts pressure on your wildlife who are trying to survive. This puts very, very expensive pressure on your wildlife colleagues who are trying to keep, or your zoology colleagues who are trying to keep your animals alive in the park. Okay? So this is an increasingly common thing. And the problem is kind of twofold. One, wildlife or pets have a lot of energy. And when you expose your pets, who are bred originally from wildlife species, to a novel environment, to novel scents and potential prey or playthings or what have you, you get the family dog who has always been super chill and relaxed, just like rocketing out into the underbrush away from your tent site because you don't have him or her staked down or on a lead or a long line, something like that. And the very, very common line that you're going to hear as a CPO or park ranger over and over and over is, "He never does this." Well, he's doing it now. And now it's everybody's problem. Okay? So, I want you to think about just the one time in that animal, in that pet's entire life, that it is running off into the underbrush to go harass wildlife, let's say, or go kill some smaller wildlife and bring it back and leave it on your RV doorstep as a gift or a warning. Who knows? Cats are evil. It's now a problem. But they never do that. I can't believe it. Oh my gosh. You got to help me find Fluffy, right? Well, what we got to do is help you manage your cat so it's not causing us a problem the rest of the entire year. So this is a video of a dog essentially rock climbing. And you can imagine a scenario in which the elderly couple that brought this dog as their retirement pet to Grand Teton or wherever your park is. He never does this. And the owners are not doing stuff like this. They're not scrambling up these rocks. They're just kind of tired retirees. But here they go. Now we've got to figure out how to get this dog back. And crucially, we have to ask, how many cliff obligate creatures did this dog just scare the shit out of? Push them off their nests, and so their eggs cooled off to the point that they're no longer viable. And so those peregrine falcons are going to spend the next 4 months trying to raise eggs that are not going to hatch because they're already dead, because a dog likes to go rock climbing. So, when we think about human impacts, we have to extend our awareness and understanding of what human presence does. We got to augment that understanding by a lot. So one of the common research projects for a recreation ecologist like me is to get GIS files of habitat polygons for, let's say, Shawnee National Forest, and a trails layer, a polyline layer that shows the network of trails, and GPS point cloud data that shows when and where and how people sort of move throughout that trail system, and occasionally off trail or cross country. And the project is to figure out, okay, I've got a wildlife population here, I've got some hikers that are sort of moving around there, and occasionally they'll take a side trail through that habitat. Is there any problem that's going on? And using the GIS, we set up a simulation model. We have virtual hikers flowing through this virtual trail system, and we can track very, very tightly, okay, based on this recorded GPS track, this person would have line of sight to this nesting pair, that nesting pair, but not these other 10. So, all right, 2 out of 12 impacted, 1 out of 6. Our local population of those nesting birds probably okay. But dogs, when you take your dog, has anybody ever taken your dog hiking? Anybody ever gone hiking with your dog? All right. Your dog goes 2 to 4 times as far as you do. Have you ever observed your dog running up ahead on the trail, and then running back to make sure you're still there, and then running back behind you, and then running up ahead, and then off into the grass or the weeds or the understory forest forbs and back to you. And if you spend the next 2 hours after the hike checking for ticks all over your dog, it's because they can cover 2 to 4 times as much as a human does. They are smaller. And so the square cube rule of strength to weight ratio works in the dog's favor. We have to be very, very biomechanically efficient in how we walk. We're exhaustion hunters. In sub-Saharan Africa back in the day, way before civilization, we'd walk after stuff until that stuff was so tired it would literally drop dead, and then we'd eat it. But we have to be very biomechanically efficient in order to survive that ourselves. So you and I don't muscularly walk by pushing ourselves forward with muscular contractions. We fall forward, and then at the last second, swing a foot to catch us, but not stop us, just enough to keep us mostly upright-ish. So you're constantly falling forward as you walk. If you were doing muscular exertion, and I'm exaggerating my step here just a little bit so you can see how much work this is, we can keep this up for a minute or two, up to our anaerobic threshold, and then we have to stop. We have to stop. Our muscles will fail. But we can sure walk for a lot more than 2 minutes at a time, right? Because we are barely spending calories at all, just to slowly catch ourselves, not quite fall forward, but tip forward just enough that we're letting gravity do most of the work, okay? So, a dog, which is a tiny fraction of our size, has a higher effective strength and can do a whole lot more running and so forth than we can, proportional to its size. And so that's putting into a lot more contact with a lot more wildlife a lot more times. Okay? So, that psychological rationalization of, oh, but my dog never does this. Oh, my dog is never the problem, is very, very, very powerful. So when we get into the human cognition section of the class, we'll talk a little bit more about rationalization. But just put a pin in that one for now. You have to understand that if you're a ranger and you got to be the bad guy for a second and say, hey, your dog is off leash, I'm really sorry, I have to write you this ticket because we have endangered species and your dog is terrorizing them right now as we speak. So you have to stop this. Here's your ticket. That's a very unpopular thing to do, of course, right? Nobody is excited about the prospect of writing speeding tickets and bad behavior tickets in beautiful places, as the saying goes, okay? So that's a thing. We have to help folks understand, hey, your dog is like a low-key, less efficient wolf. So treat it like a wolf when it's in wildlife habitat. Keep it out of the habitat or keep it on leash. If you've ever seen a trail at the trailhead that says absolutely no dogs, this is why. That and water quality. Dogs often poop in hiker water sources. And after the visible feces chunks, the macropheces are washed away, all of the fecal coliform, all of the viruses and so forth, those still remain in that water source but undetectable by the naked eye at least. Okay? So, alright, we're proud of our Blondie Labrador Retriever or our Golden Retriever. It caught a fish, okay? Is that fish sustainable to catch? Right? Is that a permitted fish species, or is this like a really bad deal? Because, again, the problem isn't one dog. The problem is 500 dogs per day at your park doing stuff like this. 500. It could be pretty hard to keep things up and running. It's completely understandable why this dog wants to chase after a whole bunch of waterfowl, right? Like if that's a Labrador Retriever, it was literally bred for this and similar things. And people are so surprised that, oh my gosh, he never does this, right? That person was not planning on getting dragged into a pond. They didn't see it coming. But if you take just a second to stop and think, oh yeah, this is a hunting dog breed. it's going to do hunting dog behaviors around wildlife, even in like a neighborhood park kind of a setting, okay? Now, we do have some awesome dog owners, some dog trainers who are highly responsible and highly ethical. And for our purposes as park managers, park rangers, those dogs, ecologically speaking, they don't even exist because they're on leash the whole time, they're extremely well behaved, and the owner is proactive in looking ahead for problem spots and managing it and giving the dog good options, a good way through or forward. I was the advisor for the service dogs in training RSO here on campus. The amount of training that goes into a service animal is absolutely stupefying. Like, there's a reason they cost $20,000 to $25,000 to produce each one. And yeah, we don't care about those. We just care about the other 99.9% of the dogs in the park, right, that are potentially causing problems to your wildlife. So if you care about wildlife, then you want to understand that most folks are not thinking at all about how their dog could be potentially magnifying their impact. They may not be aware of their impacts at all. Okay? So, a healthy adult dog on a good day can break 4 times the total miles hiked by somebody. Now, if that somebody is hiking 20 miles that day, if they're healthy and fit and preconditioned and they want to eat up some trail miles, 20 to 25 miles per day is not particularly hard for a conditioned and prepared human being. That was my average mileage on the AT after I got up to speed. Okay? 25 miles a day, about 6 days a week. We can handle that. But the dog, again, 2 to 4 times that. So that's a lot of extra habitat contacted or potentially impacted and so forth. And because dogs are lower slung to the ground, they don't have quite as many difficulties or dispreferences to go like sideways into vegetation. Right? They can go under branching vegetation and encounter relatively little resistance. Okay? So, these 4-legged meat missiles have a lot of presence ecologically when they're off leash. And that was a pretty awesome video example of going off leash. This is what the dog came for, right? But there's surely not much. Look at those eyes. My dog would never hurt a soul. Ever. Okay? But that harassment is a thing. It is absolutely a thing. So we want to think of dogs as a very special class of charismatic fauna. They're so charismatic, they get us to pick up their feces, to feed them for free for the rest of their lives, and so forth, and groom them, and give them cute little collars, and kick-started harnesses, and like expensive aftermarket upgrades for your vehicle, probably a Subaru, right? Like, the stereotypes are real, okay? And because dogs are highly empathic animals, or we impute a lot of emotional value to them, that means that rationalization, not my dog never does stuff like this, is really, 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 really strong. Okay? So, expect it. Expect that as the ranger. Plan on that being a thing. People are going to treat their dogs like special cases, and in some cases, that special casing means that they are turning their brains off or turning a blind eye. So the impact of one of these dogs might be entirely negative impact to humans. If somebody's dog is barking all night in the campground, that's hundreds of people with degraded sleep the next couple of days. Hundreds of people having a slightly harder time thinking, having a slightly harder time driving safely, having a slightly harder time recuperating from low-key injuries while they're out hiking and so forth. Sleep does a lot. So these pet impacts, these really are a big deal, right? Okay, if somebody's sleep is impacted for a couple of days because of some other person's dog, now it's unfortunate and so forth. But again, we're talking about all of this at scale. Hundreds of people with degraded sleep. Everybody's a little bit grouchier. Everybody's having a little bit less of a good time based on one single dog or one mindless owner. Okay? So, a common excuse that folks will make is, oh, my dog is just playing. And that may be true, right? The dog maybe is very friendly. Our puppy has not an aggressive fiber in his entire body, and when he meets new friends, he immediately flips over on his back in a very submissive, like safe for the other dog kind of a posture. Super, super gentle. But the just playing isn't just playing necessarily for the wildlife species involved, okay? Now in this case, this is benign, but in some other cases, the just playing means damage to property and damage to wildlife, okay? So, we're gonna deal with a lot of visitors who are not taking measures like this. Using PPE, personal protective equipment, like we deal with in a lot of our classes for tree climbing and firefighting work and so forth, right? Most of our visitors are not gonna go hiking barefoot over sharp rocks, but they'll absolutely bring their dog barefoot, so to speak, over sharp rocks. And so, in some places where this is appropriate, you can require visitors to have booties for their dog, for example. Like if the pavement is super hot, like you really can fry eggs on the sidewalk at Death Valley. Well, imagine a dog that doesn't have any shoes walking on a 150-degree sidewalk, right? Like that is literally cooking the meat of their feet. That's very, very bad. Okay? That takes a long time to heal and it's very painful. Okay? You're cooking those nerves as well as the callus and musculature. Okay. So, pet abandonment is another kind of thing, but it's a little bit less common and also way more injurious to the ecosystem that you are trying to run. So, people will release their dog or cat, or in particular their horses. While we were on the field trip, we were talking about feral horses that people had released when times get tough or hay prices go through the roof at Ozark National Scenic Riverways. And now you, the ranger, have to do something like pay to sterilize or euthanize or adopt out somebody else's problem, somebody else's bad idea, right? A lot of people who should not have horses because they can't afford it get horses, because horses are a part of our American culture, our background, right? Think about America without cowboys and cowgirls and stuff like that. It'd be weird, right? It'd be less beef. We all like beef. So, a lot of folks who are kind of on the bubble for being able to afford a dog or a horse or whatever, ball pythons in Florida, when times get tough, they don't want to do the emotionally taxing thing of, or the expensive thing that they can't afford, of taking their animal to the vet to have it euthanized if it is ill or very elderly and the quality of life is low, or adopting it out or whatever. They'll just trailer it to a national park and be like, be free, hold me, Tom, I'm sad. And like, the horse is like, okay, whatever, I guess there's some grass over here, I'll just eat. And then they drive off, and now it's your problem as the ranger. This is a very, very common thing. It's expensive, nobody's happy about this, but this is what some people do, or this is how some people treat their national parks and forests and so forth, okay? So, any kind of an economic stressor, heat wave, drought, the Great Recession of 2007 caused a lot of this. Just individual people falling on hard times, right? Now they're our problem. So, the issue is that horses need a lot of feed to get a little bit of calorie and nutrient value out of it. And so a single horse released into a park, or even worse, a breeding pair of horses released into a park, is a major, major concern. They'll trample and destroy quite a bit of stuff in their quest to just constantly feed as hard as they can. Okay, so the Bureau of Land Management has sunk millions and millions and millions of dollars into trying to deal with feral horse and pony populations out west. So we get things like forced culling programs. So Smokey is not a pet, right? But when the public gets wind of your sharpshooters having to do things like shoot charismatic animals like horses, oh my God, this is basically Hitler, right? We're killing horses for no visible good reason to the public. They're not seeing the environmental cost of somebody releasing their horse onto your park, okay? Or when we have food-attracted animals, we'll get into that later, like bears. Bears will go up to a couple of 100 miles after having been tranq darted and transported away to try and fix their food attraction addiction. They'll travel up to a couple of 100 miles overland to get back to that unlocked dumpster. Because that unlocked dumpster is like this much effort. For those of you listening at home, not very much effort. Versus having to browse and eat a whole bunch of berries and stuff like that instead of extremely calorie-dense refined foods like you and I just kind of don't really think about with our industrial food supply these days. Our food products that are ultra-processed and calorie-concentrated and so forth, right? That's a big boon, or it's seen as a big boon or received as a big boon to wildlife species and so forth. Okay, so we gotta start shooting those animals. At Grand Canyon, there was a whole bunch of animals, mule deer, blacktail, all kinds of stuff, that looked like this. This is not particularly to scale, I'm not particularly an artist, but they had legs, they had this silhouette to them when you approached them from the side. It looked like they were pregnant or they had pot bellies. And this was a function of deer in the relatively really pretty nutrient poor, nutrient depleted area of South Rim Village of the Grand Canyon up on a 7,500 foot elevation plateau in pinyon juniper woodland where there's just not a lot of lush vegetation, right? It's all drought deciduous or evergreen, drought tolerant, deserty or semi-arid type plants. They were finding food left out on people's picnic tables at their campsites. There were deer finding not even just like open coolers, but just like if you find some crumbs or like the crust of somebody's bread flopping around in their garbage bag, which has blown off onto the ground, even that is a lot more calories. That taste a lot more intensely with their synthetic flavors. And all the sugar added to stuff like white bread, sugar added to peanut butter these days, like this is calorie dense stuff. Even if you're just finding little scraps at one site, you got 450 other sites. And while you're eating this calorie dense food, you're eating some of the wrappers too. Because if you're a deer, you don't have prehensile fingers. You don't really have flexible toes. You're just hoovering everything up with your mouth, and we might get a little bit of mylar aluminized foil oxygen impermeable like Cliff Bar wrapper in with those Cliff Bar crumbs, yeah? So you can see in those trash bags a whole lot of wrappers. Everything's individually packaged typically, and some crumbs. So if we get some of those crumbs, we might get a lot of those wrappers, and those wrappers might form a big ball or a bolus, which is fancy Latin for, ball, stuck in your belly. And the moment that foil ball gets bigger than the intestinal sphincter at the bottom of your stomach, at the top of your small intestine, the moment you can't pass that through and excrete it, you're in starvation mode. You can keep eating and eating and eating, and your stomach will produce the enzymes and the acid to digest that stuff, except for the plastic, which is pretty immune to acid attacks. We should make a plastic type Pokemon. You'd be completely immune to acid attacks, you know, in the paper, rock, scissors of the game. You get real hungry, you're breaking the stuff down, but you're not absorbing any of the nutrients. It's all just kind of piling up in your stomach because you got this foil plug, to the point that the foil plug can get pretty big on a full-size deer, like the size of a big cantaloupe or maybe like a volleyball, right? I mean, big, distended is the term. Stomach. Looks like they're pregnant, like really pregnant, okay? And when you get this animal is in absolute starvation mode. They are eating as much as they can and getting more wrappers and adding to the problem. And so the behavior is essentially permanently modified. Like once animals get hooked on industrially processed human foods and our excitotoxically strong synthetic flavors and our intense calorie density, then they're not going to stop doing that, because any of that feels in the moment a hell of a lot better than eating yet more pinyon pine nuts. What are we having today, Pinky? Pinyon pine nuts, brain. Same thing we have every day, right? So, a Clif Bar sounds like a pretty good deal to something like this. Now, if this was an individual, highly prized animal like a family pet, we can take it to a veterinarian who can open up the gut, pull that foil ball out, and sew the animal back up, put it on some pretty baller antibiotics, and be good to go. The problem is, if you've got dozens or hundreds of deer like that, you can't afford a veterinarian to do 100 wildlife gut surgeries. Like, that just doesn't scale. And that doesn't fix the problem because they're addicted, right? They're gonna go right back to doing this the moment they are able to, the moment they're steady enough to walk again. And bears, other very, very mobile species, will cover hundreds of miles to get back to a known food source like this. Pretty impressive stuff, okay? So, we have to understand that we're dealing with this at scale. You and I are part of the mechanism depicted in this, I believe this is XKCD if I recall. For those of you who are Randall Munroe fans, take a look at biomass and what's left out there in terms of wildlife. So we've got more biomass in horses than we have in almost all of the other land mammals combined worldwide. We have so many horses that people are dropping off spare horses at your park to go feral and breed and eat everything that's not nailed down. Okay? Half of the water of the Colorado River, fully half, is going into cattle so that we can have cheaper hamburgers, because we really want cheaper hamburgers, okay? We are cutting down the Amazon, which is right on that threshold of irreversible decline or grasslandification as a function of drying out and heating up from extremely aggressive logging. That's done for cattle ranching, so that Burger King Whoppers are a little bit cheaper. A little bit cheaper. Brazilian beef is extremely unsustainable and is trading against literally generating 1 out of 5 breaths of oxygen that you and I and everything else need. Okay, so this is really out of scale, right? We are you and I, as park rangers, we're working on keeping a tiny fraction of the tiny fraction of this slide that is green. Does that make sense? Our national parks, our forests, our wildlife refuges, our wilderness areas, our national grasslands and so forth represent a fairly small fraction, the green stuff, of what's even out there, okay? And this biomass of humans is coming into these green spots, these green areas, and putting pressure with our presence and our pets and our Cliff Bars and our Mylar wrappers, right? Those little tiny fringes that are left are under a lot of pressure, okay? So this is what's at stake here. Our wildlife serve as a really good proxy for kind of the whole system and how completely and utterly humans dominate not just our landscape, but literally the entire surface of the planet, right? When you and I and all of our strip malls are gone, there's going to be a very thin layer of plastic and chicken bones recorded in the geologic record. That's all that's going to be left of us. We go through billions and billions of chickens because we love our chicken tendies, okay? And we have essentially reconditioned the entire surface of the planet, minus a few percent, to be able to support that beef and chicken habit, okay? So, for those of you familiar with the population doubling experiment or analogy of the Petri dish, where you have something doubling in population size, all populations have a doubling rate, right? Right before the collapse step, 50% of the resources are still available. And then one generation later, we're over 100% and fully into collapse mode in the Petri dish. Okay? So that's where we're at right now. We're in a very, very hard spot as park rangers. All right. So that was super boring and depressing. I apologize. This is very sad stuff. How's everybody doing? You need to take a quick break? Stretch your legs? Keep on trucking? All right, let's get into the next mess. Indirect and habitat degradation impacts. This is all the stuff that's not direct, like human-animal contact, human-wildlife contact kind of stuff. Okay, so we necessarily overlap into other habitats. Right, so above water, everything looks clear and beautiful and normal, and then if you dunk your head underneath, big old danger noodle, all right? Marine rec overlaps really hard into marine habitats because we tend to focus most of our marine recreation on shoreline areas, certainly on continental shelf areas, which are, shorelines, very shallow habitats, estuarine systems like river, saltwater interfaces. That's where a whole lot of reproduction happens with wildlife species, critical reproduction habitat. And that's where we are doing our forest and outdoor rec as well. And our industrial shipping too. So the issue is overlapping human habitats with wildlife habitats. And things like moose, which are using ponds, for example, to get away from the Minnesota state bird, the mosquito. Sometimes moose can hang out underwater for a really long time. And if you're in a canoe and you go over a moose is liable to wreck your stuff. So it's uncommon, but people have been really pretty seriously hurt or drowned just for the sheer bad luck of paddling their canoe or kayak over a moose that's just trying to get away from mosquitoes, right? It's a habitat overlap question. If you're in the kayak and you don't even know the moose is there, is typically the arrangement, because you can't see without polarized glasses down into the water meaningfully. Well then, this is going to be a pretty dangerous situation and it's not a harassment situation. You're not trying to get in the moose's face. If anything, if you knew the moose was there, you'd give it a pretty wide circle around, right? An adult bull moose, 7 feet high at the shoulder, right? So that's like 1.5 Dr. Parks just up to the shoulder on this thing, and then you've got a big old business end rack up top there, and moose, every once in a while, they can get pretty nuts, okay? So, our human facilities, trails, things as developed as golf courses, right? That is necessarily chewing away at those few remaining green pixels on our biomass distribution chart a couple of slides back, okay? So, we need to not be surprised when we have human-wildlife interactions. And understand that, you know, for every green and fairway that we cut in, we are changing the hydrologic regime, we are changing the nutrient profile, running off of those fertilized and manicured turfways, and so forth, right? So the larger the creature, the bigger their habitat needs to be. So an adult Kodiak grizzly bear needs multiple square miles to itself. Okay? A black bear in Great Smoky Mountains National Park or the surrounding environment, 100 square miles per individual, and grizzly bears can be more than twice the size of an adult black bear. Right? And that's not particularly hard for a grizzly to do. They need varied habitat, right? They need standing dead trees. They need big hollow trees for denning in some cases. They need all kinds of stuff. So a golf course is just not going to provide them what they actually need to get on by. All right. For airborne wildlife or other highly mobile species like black bears, the habitat size requirement by itself is absolutely enormous. Just enormous. Okay? So this applies for marine habitat as well. And this is primarily a function of size of the organism and predatory versus herbivory diet regime, right? So if they are high up on the trophic ladder, they're not primary producers, not plants, they're not herbivorous, it's a few typically very or relatively much larger carnivores needing to eat a whole lot of the herbivorous wildlife available in order to maintain their biomass, right? So here's an eagle paw and how they can interface with humans trying to use habit for the same thing that the bird is, all right? And sometimes our pollution degrades the habitat indirectly really pretty hard, right? So if you're familiar with any of the recent studies about microplastics and nanoplastics in particular, having been found inside human brain tissue, think about somebody's old Tide detergent bottle rattling around in your brain, and how that's, you know, probably not beneficial, if not actively harmful. Wildlife doesn't have any refuge or escape from our trash and litter. We can at least, you know, drink out of a glass bottle and nano filter our water and stuff like that at the tap. They can't. So they just have to take whatever and all of the pollution that we put in. Okay? So, has anybody ever seen a video like this? This is a common thing to do at certain cliff faces where the wind pattern is stable and blowing in your face. You throw something out and you can catch it right back, right? 40, 50 mile an hour winds sustained. This is typically something that's done very commonly in certain spots along the Irish coast where you have, you know, 100-200 foot cliffs and ocean breezes just blasting or buffeting that side of the island basically continuously. It makes for a cool video. And at the bottom of the cliff, there's a shitload of trash, right? For all of the people that threw it just a little bit too hard and didn't get to recover it, okay? This pattern is also present at places like, anybody ever been to Garden of the Gods? And done the brief sort of loop hike from the parking lot through the rock formations? Okay. There's a ton of litter at the bottom of that cliff face. Cliff faces, critical habitat for a bunch of species, right? So imagine having to fight your way through a landfill every time you're just trying to get up and take a shower, to put it in a human context, okay? So it's kind of not great. So type 2 impact is going to be our habitat modification, our indirect stuff where we're not directly interfacing with the wildlife. Where our recreation is degrading the veg, soil, or water. Where our transportation networks are fragmenting habitat. We're also impacting the wildlife as a crack-on effect, right? So we remove some of the ability of that habitat to support some of the wildlife individual organisms, and all of the rest are in kind of sufferthon mode from there, right? So driving a sand rail or dune buggy, an ATV, those are old names for them, in marginal arid habitats where each individual bush, its root wad, in a desert or semi-arid environment is a self-contained ecosystem unto itself. It gathers moisture, it serves as burrow habitat. If you're driving over that stuff in your Humvee or your, wide squatted, knobby-tired Jeep, you're just collapsing those, right? And in a semi-arid environment, each one of those collapsed burrows, for example, really affects all of the space around it within each of those rodents' kind of migration or effect radius. Okay, so food litter, microtrash, plastic rain, we're all pretty familiar with that. There's also dry plastic particles blowing across us. A couple of million tons blowing into California just off the Pacific each year. Like, think how lightweight and not dense plastic is, and how much plastic you'd have to get to 100 million tons of plastic dust. We found plastic dust on top of Everest. We found waste and litter at the bottom of Challenger Deep, the deepest known part of the ocean off the coast of Japan, Marianas Trench. This stuff is everywhere, right? So we're running a real big experiment on survivability of humans and everything else with adding plastic to everybody's diet. All right. When we cut in a campground or individual campsites in a backcountry area, that is removing habitat. And sometimes the one spot which would be perfect for a campsite is the one spot that's perfect for all the other creatures trying to live in that space as well. And so for those of you from like a forest resource background, we could consider this high grading animal habitat for human use. We find those best spots, those scenic spots, those spots with a bunch of lush vegetation and beautiful wildflowers and stuff like that, and that's prime feeding or cover habitat for somebody else. All right? Beaches are super fragile, and basically anything we do on the beach is gonna fuck something pretty hard, okay? So, sea turtles, just lights around sea turtles can disorient them, especially if it's brighter than the moon, or if it's a particular color. So, this is a video we took at summer camp at Rocky Mountain National Park, and the trails into June and early July are covered in packed snow and ice and slush. Then that stuff melts out by August and starts snowing back in around sometime in September, depending on the elevation within the park. So, what we're not seeing under trails and through snow drifts and stuff like that there are rodent runs, little mazes and networks of trails that they burrow through the excellent insulator of snow. And they get around just fine in the winter. They stay nice and toasty warm. Snow's an excellent insulator, right? We have native Alaskans and native Canadians living in snow-constructed homes in very, very cold environments and doing just fine. But when we walk across that stuff, when we drive across it in particular, we're collapsing and cutting off those burrows from each other. And if you've got a burrow here and a food supply there and it's cut off in between, you know, everybody in that burrow is going to starve to death that winter. All right. Also indirectly, we can bring in stuff like, you know, non-native species on our boots, in our horses' feces, on our boat hulls, or in the bilge is a very common one. Or removal of keystone species by habitat modification. Okay. Let's see. So if you think about habitat loss in terms of fragmentation, that is, maybe the square feet of habitat or acres of habitat doesn't drop by a lot when you consider forest roads, but the connectivity, the safety of traveling between those patches is degraded with 386,000 miles of roads just in the Forest Service. Add on top of that all of the roads in the Park Service, and all of the backcountry roads, the double track, the mechanically compacted and subgraded, double track jeeping trails in Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife and everybody else. And after a while, you're talking over 1 million miles of backcountry roads that are just chopping everything up. And the total space covered by all those roads, not a lot. But the connectivity, or the loss of connectivity that those roads cause, is a pretty big deal. So, effectively speaking, elk and deer, if we want to talk in round terms, round numbers, those roads are a 400-meter wide swath that is less desirable because it's less safe for them. So, yeah, they could still access the habitat within that buffer, but they don't want to, right? So we rely on a whole bunch of zoology studies as recreation ecologists to figure out, okay, if I put in a road, here's how many acres of habitat I'm bulldozing to put in that road. But here's how many acres I'm really sort of taking off the table for the species that I'm trying to manage while trying to put some road connectivity in. Okay, so changing winter elk distribution. Elk don't have a lot of options these days, right? Everything is so compartmentalized and fragmented that anything that needs a big territory is just really hurting. I mean, I don't know how else to say it here. Excuse me. Where we have roads, and where we see those roads modifying wildlife behaviors, like using our roads for migration, like we saw, a week ago on Wednesday. Moose running down the road, bears trying to cross the road into a snowbank that had been plowed and was too tall for some of the cubs to cross, that sort of thing, right? This is real calculus, it's not hypothetics. Okay, so positively or negatively, we can improve habitat with things like roads and trails for certain species. It's not an even effect across everybody, and we can positively affect one species and negatively affect another. The ants at Yosemite National Park will not cross visitor-created foot trails. They're too big, they're too hot, they're too bright, they're too sunny to expose to predators. So even in a meadow the size of this classroom, we can cause colony collapse of ants by having a trail that just bisects that little meadow. That's all it takes, right? And we're not thinking about the ants, but think about the outsized, the enormous ecosystem dynamic effects that ant colonies have. They change everything when they are there, and everything changes for the worse when they are not. So, if they're native ants, right? So, these habitat changes from roads could be positive, could be negative, but you have to evaluate that on a species-specific basis, and then also on an interspecies basis as well. So, on an intra-species basis at Denali National Park, grizzly bear boars, the males, adult male grizzly bears in sexual maturity, will pursue and eat male cubs, even their own, to reduce sexual competition in the grizzly population locally. Because of this, grizzly sows, the mama bears, hang out on and even walk along the one road at Denali National Park because the boar grizzlies don't want to do that. In the same way that the elk and deer try to stay at least 200 meters away from a road and not quite as far from trails typically, but they do certainly cross at times. Adult male grizzly bears don't want to be anywhere near the road. So a compensatory adaptation that the grizzly sows are doing to protect their young is they hang out right next to the road. You know, that's a problem because there's not any nutrients in the road. There's not any good cover habitat in the road. You're highly visible in that space. And you have to go away from the road to get any of the sparsely available calorie density for grizzly bears in the form of berries, typically, at Denali National Park. So we put in a road that changes grizzly dynamics dramatically on site. We put in a hiking trail, and a study found in the 70s or 80s that bear habitat increases up the mountainside well beyond their natural limits when they learn that they can follow backpackers, scare the backpackers away from their food sacks, and eat the food, and then they drop back down below tree line, head back to the trail to do it again with the next group of people going up. Okay? So you put in a trail, and that can effectively expand bear habitat right up into the alpine zone. Otherwise, they have zero incentive to go up in the alpine zone. There's no trees growing there. So this can be complex. That's on an intraspecies level. On an interspecies level, we put in a campground at low elevation. People spill or leave breadcrumbs or whatever in their campsite or in their semi-permanent camp, like tent village, like at Yosemite National Park. There's a whole bunch of like heavy cotton, wax cotton canvas tents that you can rent, for example, like yurts, stuff like that. A yurt is like a round tent-y structure, popular out west. And with those crumbs, we get a whole bunch of mice. From the mice, we get hantavirus in the mouse droppings. So they eat the crumbs, they poop nearby, that poop dries out, pulverizes or becomes dust, and the next person 6 months later, at the start of the next visitation season, flops down their sleeping bag, a little puff of dust comes up and settles down on the sleeping bag, and several days later, they're in the emergency room dying of a hantavirus infection, right? It's got a 50% mortality rate because of crumbs. Interspecies impacts when we move recreation into a space. Okay? Hantavirus, not even once. So, we can essentially fragment the habitat for penguins with our anchor lines on our rafts. Sierra, I apologize for showing this video clip. I know that you've been traumatized by raft paddling. I apologize. Sometimes we gotta break eggs to make omelets here. But the lesson here is pretty direct, right? So how we set up on the sandbar directly affects the wildlife that is also perched on that sandbar, okay? So, in response to this, we issue permits to the concessioners renting visitors these rafts and say, you have to not use XYZ sandbar if there are penguins present, for example. All right. We're also, these days, doing a better job of trying to understand and manage in response to how our temporary visitors, in terms of wildlife, so migratory species like butterflies, or certain butterflies, like old growth oak, like virgin oak stands, there are a couple of thousand species of butterfly that need specifically that, old growth oak. And a mixed age, well managed stand isn't good enough, right? So in core habitat spaces like national parks, we can eventually get to that old growth status and protect it for species that might only be there a matter of weeks year round. But if this is like the last island of migratory habitat that they have anywhere in the Mississippi Flyway, for example, then this is pretty important. It's really important, even though they're not there very long. Okay. Exogenous threats like climate change obviously are rapidly pushing things out of existence with the Sky Island effect. Does everybody know what the Sky Island effect is? Hand up if you're very sure what the Sky Island effect is. Nobody. Okay, so let's talk about this for... So, when you have a mountain ridge, it's likely to be hotter down at the foot of the slope. Make sense? All right. The reason why it is hotter at the bottom end of the slope and why it's really hot at Death Valley is because of low elevation. As you go down toward the center of the earth, air density increases. So we've got adiabatic and katabatic airflow. We're going to talk about this in more detail in the air resources section coming up here, but adiabatic expansion, katabatic flow downward is basically why it's going to be hotter down at the foot of the mountain. It's going to be pretty cold up on top of the ridgeline, or it's going to be cooler than whatever is normal down at the base. Right? So if we have a very tall mountain, let's say a 14er, like in Colorado, it's very common to see this kind of a conformation. So we can have legit desert at the floor of the mountain range. This is more common in like Arizona and New Mexico than it is in Colorado, but they have some tall mountains too where we see the same effect. Okay? It's hot, it's dry, and this mountain is typically forcing a lot of rain down on the windward side, and so on the leeward side or the sheltered side, it's even drier. Okay? And then as you go up the mountain, it cools. You get a little bit more cloud nucleation from that cooling air. Cooler air has less ability to hold moisture or water vapor in it, and so it wants to come out as rain or dew. And so we go up from open desert floor to shrubby, scrubby, semi-arid stuff. So like low bushes, tufted grasses, that sort of thing. And then we get into drought tolerant, maybe some pine trees that like sandy, sunny, more dry conditions, or at least can outcompete in those conditions. Stuff like ponderosa. And then we get a little bit higher up, and we have this sort of deciduous tree band, and then higher up still, we have boreal forest species, so like spruce, fir, tamarack, larch. And then up above that, we have a couple of really small trees, krummholz. I don't know if there's a T in krummholz or not. Anyway, so that's right at tree line. And then we would consider all of those montane transitions, right? So desert, montane, subalpine, alpine, and then way up at the top we might have snow caps. We'll call that cryo, like in our water resources section. Our glaciers are a kind of resource. Okay, so Our Sky Island effect is this. Let's say you've got a mammal species, like, anybody know what a chinchilla is? Okay. How would you describe a chinchilla to somebody if they have no idea what a chinchilla looked like?
Bug-eyed koala.
Bug-eyed koala, rabbity looking thing, super fuzzy? Not so much. We're talking like Pikachu or Rattata.
Fuzzy.
Fuzzy, all right. So, as it turns out, chinchilla and other species like them, they can't handle real hot temperatures because they're adapted for fairly cold temperatures. So if you have something like that, at some point, if this is a genuinely big temperature gradient, and it can be 70 degrees from the top of the Grand Canyon to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, right? 100 degrees up top and 30 degrees below freezing down at the bottom, right? This temperature effect is a real thing and it is large. Let's say there's another mountain over here with equally good habitat. Okay? This thing is going to overheat and die, period, if it goes down into the desert. It's just too hot. Even if the thing tries to migrate overnight, just too hot. So, that means if it's too hot to survive down on the desert floor, this thing is essentially a cool island in a sea of lava, right? This is the floor is lava for wildlife, but it's actually like we will die if we go down and touch that desert floor. We'll overheat and that's it, okay? So when you have this kind of a regime, you can think of this island as a sky island. It's a thermal island. It's cool up here, nice and survivable, and so forth, not survivable down here. Now, go back to, what, 1880? Things were, on average, just over 2 degrees cooler. Worldwide, average annual global surface temperature was just over 2 degrees Fahrenheit cooler in the 1880s. Okay? Now, come back to 2023, 143 years later. Things have heated up 2 degrees around the world on average. So, where it was too hot at this elevation and lower in 1880, now it's too hot here in 2023 for our fuzzy little creature. Okay? So the Sky Island is shrinking, or from the perspective of something trapped up here on the Sky Island, the island is sinking down into the lava, right? So there's less surface area, less habitat, and eventually what has happened in some places for some borderline cases and species is that the 2023 line isn't here, it's up here, beyond the top of the ridgeline. And in that case, the whole island has sunk into the lava, so to speak, the hot desert floor that is too hot for these creatures to survive. Okay? So, the Sky Island problem is a wildlife problem caused by climate change. And climate change does a bunch of other things, a bunch of other ways, but this is a key one for wildlife, right? You and I, we can drop onto the desert floor and just crank up the AC on our Tesla and draw down the battery and be fine. They can't. They are obligate to that cooler environment, and so the temperature gradient just keeps marching up the slope a little bit. And as we all know, it's not a steady thing year on year. The temperature plot is a very jagged line over time. And the peaks and troughs on that plot get bigger. I'm exaggerating the transition from 1880 to 2023 on the temperature plot here by a lot. But the idea is that, okay, it just takes 1 year, it just takes 1 day for the temperature to get too hot anywhere on this mountain and they all die off. And then the temperature is going to swing back down. But the fact of climate change amplifying the oscillation, making the temperature graph swingier, peakier, okay? Like a hydrograph of a paved area versus a mature closed canopy forest area. It's going to be a way peakier hydrograph for all of you hydrogeologists out there when you're looking at a parking lot, okay? Peaks and troughs get bigger as climate change amplifies the effects, okay? We get things like polar vortices that swing it way down, and then in places like Washington and Oregon, where it's typically kind of cold and rainy, we have this sequence of weeks where the temperature just sits at 100 or higher, and not only a whole bunch of wildlife dying, not only a whole bunch of forest fires get started, but like humans start dying. Over the past 50 years, heat waves typically kill anywhere from hundreds to the low 10,000s of people. So in places like France and the UK and Germany, they don't have as much AC as we do. Those temperature swings, you push it up over a certain amount, and the Sky Island effect is kind of the same thing for somebody without AC. Most of the world doesn't have AC, right? We're very fortunate in the United States too, but we also burn an absolutely crazy amount of fossil fuels to power our AC. And we have to increase our power allocation to AC as things get hotter. So we dump more carbon into the atmosphere to cool ourselves down, and it heats everything else up. Do you see the self-reinforcing problem there? Big problem. All right, cool. Let's end a few minutes early with that. So, as a park ranger and a forester, climate change is not primarily your individual fault. With our Western lifestyle, it is all of our faults. None of us is living sustainably in a carbon neutral way at this time. Not even close. But it is our problem to manage. And the upshot is that foresters have a lot of knobs to twist and levers to pull on fighting climate change, helping us eventually get back to that stable garden climate that we've enjoyed for the last 10,000 years. All right. I'm here for questions, comments, feedback. Let me know how things are going. Otherwise, hang on to that exercise we did today in class and take a look at your national park that you've chosen for this semester and take a look at the overall use level numbers. That's just a basic how many people per year. And run for any of your species, any of your key species, right? Our short list of 2, 3, 4 species that we really need to pay attention to in your specific national park. Pick one of those and run the dog calculation on it. Let's say you've got a bunch of elk at your park, right? We've seen some examples with that at Grand Canyon and everywhere else. Gosh, there are elk everywhere. See what the average annual visitation for your park is over the last couple of years. That should be available on the park website. We'll get into a much more detailed version of park use level, but for our purposes, we're just looking for a round number. Round it off to the closest million, up or down, just to keep the math simple. And then out of those people per year, let's say 1 in 20 brings a dog. And of those, what is your dog getting into relative to the elk or whatever the species of interest is at your site? Are some fearless dogs running up to the elk calves and barking at them and forcing the cow and bull elk into like a defensive posture? How many times a day is that going to happen on average based on your round number calculations? All right? Cool. Let's bring that in for Monday, and we'll pick it up here with wildlife. We'll try to get to the wildlife behavioral responses, which are really interesting, coming up.